My name is Ada Shamil and I'm Project Officer with the National Youth Health Programme. The Worldwide Ireland Funds are a philanthropic network that supports worthy causes in Ireland and around the world. Its mission is to be the largest network of Friends of Ireland dedicated to supporting programmes of peace and reconciliation, arts and culture, education and community and development throughout the island of Ireland. It was founded in 1976 and it currently operates in 12 countries and to date has raised over $450 million. So in the breakout workshop, Katrina is going to talk about the experience of being both a funder and a fundraiser. Also, she's going to share what makes a successful funding application and speak honestly about the current funding situation and environment in Ireland. So what are the key insights that hopefully you can take away from today's workshop? You'll get insights and tips for drafting funding applications and approaching funders, and also get a realistic assessment of the funding environment in Ireland currently from a key stakeholder. So I hope you enjoyed the workshop. We'll try and keep as close to time as possible, and I'll now hand over to Katrina and Jordan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone, and thanks for choosing our workshop. As you heard in the introduction, myself and Jordan are going to sort of split this today. In the Ireland Funds, we have sort of the perspective of being both a fundraising organisation and a funder. So we hope to give you a bit of perspective on both sides of that. We want to sort of avoid the mechanics of fundraising because you can get that elsewhere, but we will touch on that. But more to talk about the environment that we're operating in today. And you know, I think this workshop was actually really timely. When I was thinking about it over the last few weeks, I was thinking about what a challenging environment we're operating in terms of fundraising in Ireland. I think when you look at what's come out in the news in the last 24 hours, it makes it even more challenging. And yet I sort of feel there's great opportunity for all of us in that. You know, just to give you 60 seconds on the Ireland Funds, as you heard, we've been around since 1976. We're in the middle of a fundraising campaign at the moment, which we started in 2009. To raise 100 million over 5 years in response to sort of the circumstances in Ireland. At the close of this year, which was the end of our campaign deadline and the deadline and the target of raising 100 million, we're at 150 million, and we've agreed to continue the campaign for an additional 2 years and reach the target of 200 million. And you know, the response of our donors has been magnificent, and in some ways it's quite an easy time to raise money for projects in Ireland to sort of informed donors in the US. I mean, people understand what the needs are in Ireland, they understand the circumstances, they have real faith in the charitable sector here, a real understanding of what the sector can deliver. But most of our money is raised overseas, and 95% of it comes from the American Ireland Fund. So fundraising in Ireland is obviously quite different. We spend our money as we raise it. So we don't have an endowment. We start every year with nothing in the bank, and we have to raise every penny that we give out in grants. So unlike other large foundations in Ireland, particularly Atlantic and One, we don't have an endowment. So we can't really plan how we're going to make our grants. It depends on what we raise. It depends on who gives it to us. Most of the money we raise is what we call donor advised, so the donors decide where the money goes. We have a small pool of unrestricted money, which is really the pipeline for all our donor advised funds, and Jordan will talk about how you apply for that and what makes a good application for that. But that's about $1 million a year, which is a really relatively small amount of our overall spend. We give grants of somewhere between 15 and 20 million a year. But that 1 million unrestricted really is where we get all our information on needs in Ireland, all our information about the sorts of organisations that are meeting those needs, and the sort of organisations that we can present to our donors ultimately for the larger amounts of money. You know, I don't want to sound pessimistic, and I was really sort of thinking about that today. How do you not sound pessimistic in this environment in Ireland at the moment? But it is really, really challenging. We all know that. I mean, it would just be interesting for me to kind of get a sense of how many people here have fundraising as part of their job. Right, so quite a few. Yeah, so I mean, I think there's plenty of reasons to be pessimistic and feeling challenged, and genuinely I think the whole top-ups discussion, I listened to it for a long time this morning on on the radio is a real body blow to anyone who's trying to fundraise at the moment. And yet, you know, the big challenge in Ireland for organisations that are fundraising, I think, is the lack of transparency and the lack of being really clear about why fundraised income is important. And so I think that's an opportunity for all of us to address that, but we'll talk more about that in a minute. In terms of just the basics of fundraising, we weren't going to get into that today because there are plenty of other places you can get that, but I just wanted to mention a couple of resources. One is we have this toolkit on our website. I don't know if any of you have it. We actually don't have it in printed copy, in printed format anymore, but you'll get it on our website. It's called the Philanthropy and Fundraising Toolkit. It was put together by our previous CEO, Kingsley Aikens, who really is an expert in fundraising. And there's just plenty of good tips and good advice here. And I'd encourage, if you don't have it, to take a look at it on the website. It's just a really useful tool on all the basics of fundraising. The other thing is that, you know, if you are fundraising and kind of don't feel you're there yet, I would take a look at Fundraising Ireland. You know, they have a diploma now, they have all sorts of training courses. And I think that fundraising frequently is looked at as an add-on for people in their job, and it's not rocket science. I think most of us, you know, can get our head around it, but I think it is important to scale up a little bit, and it is important to sort of get yourself as ready for fundraising as you can, if that's part of your spec. And you know, it all boils down to fundraising. All boils down to having the right cause and a well-articulated cause, and this is something that Jordan will talk about. You know, we get so many applications from organisations in the arts space, in the youth space, in the education space, and it's hard to distinguish what each organisation is doing. And you know, there's no question about it. You know, we are all doing what we do because of the worthy mission of our organisations. Articulating that mission is so challenging, and I would really encourage you, as you think about fundraising, to spend some time figuring out how to articulate your case for support. And be really clear on the difference and the work of your organisation. Again, we get so many applications from organisations that are helping disadvantaged youth, or that are, you know, helping to grow the arts in Ireland, or that are after school this or preschool that. You know, you have to distinguish yourself from other organisations. You have to make it clear why your organisation is important. What mission are you trying to deliver? I would spend a huge amount of your time cracking that before you go out trying to raise money. Secondly, I think you have to, in terms of fundraising, I think it's really important to look at who your constituency is for raising money. And that is obviously the big challenge for all of us. I think with so many organisations fundraising at the moment, I mean, we're in a bit of a perfect storm in Ireland at the moment. You have the two largest private philanthropies withdrawing, taking out about 80 million a year in funding. Who's going to replace that? I don't think there's any obvious answer to that at the moment. Secondly, we have a recession, so all the kind of traditional sources of funding, government cutbacks, corporate fundraising events, all those traditional sources of fundraising are drying up. So where do we look to replace that? And then of course government cutbacks. You know, we're all facing you know, steady. We had one organisation in with us that said over the last 5 years they have 63% of their resources from government have been cut back. And one of the things we're really seeing this year is that I think a lot of organisations were surviving on things like reserves or sort of ongoing arrangements with corporates that are drying up. There really is a sense of every cut that has possibly been made has been made, and yet I'm sure for everyone in this room, the demand for your services, the need for what you're doing is growing. So it is a bit of a perfect storm. And, you know, I heard Fergus Finlay on the radio this morning talking about that. And in some ways, I think we probably as a sector haven't done a good enough job explaining that storm, that challenge, that resources are going down, that the demand for our services are going up. And yet, I think, particularly for the arts sector, there's an opportunity for us to present the work that you guys are doing in the organisations that you're doing as a really important part of the fabric of Ireland, of the recovery in Ireland, of the, you know, kids are our future, and Ireland is known as a sort of a country that has invested in this in the past. So challenge, opportunity, trying to balance the two without sounding Pollyannish about it, because it is really difficult. But who is your constituency? Who are you going to go after to raise your money? And one of the things that I think we all need to look at is going away from the traditional targets for support. I don't know what kind of fundraising you do, but I do know that all the easily identifiable wealthy people are absolutely under siege. We had one person tell us who appears on every sort of rich list and would be a well-known name. He told us that in 1 week he had 80 pitches from organisations, either letter, visit, request. You know, that's 79 of those are going to go nowhere, possibly all 80. It just doesn't make sense. Where we're seeing some success with certain organisations is really mining into your own databases, your own touch points. Who is benefiting from, like, not necessarily the people that you're providing the support to, but I think for arts organisations, you know, who are your audiences? Who knows what you're doing? Things like legacies, things like people who've come to your events, things, you know, we have to look within our own resources, and really it's pointless and exhausting to be going after completely cold prospects in this environment. They are all under siege. So we have to really look at our own constituency base. And then I think the third thing for organisations is who is providing the leadership in this. And, you know, both the leadership in fundraising, but the leadership internally in endorsing what you're trying to do as fundraising. And, you know, do you have a lead donor who can help you identify other donors, who can introduce you to other people, who can talk about why they've made a donation. It's up to every organisation to decide what is a leadership donation. But, you know, for some organisations it's 1,000, for others it's 50,000, 100,000, whatever. But I think it is about trying to identify some leadership as you do this. And then with all of that in mind, you know, I think the sort of three final things for the people who are wearing the fundraising hat in the organisation. I think we all have to get realistic within our own organisations. That's realistic with our board, realistic with our CEO. You know, what sort of resources are we putting into fundraising? Who's doing it? How much do we want to raise? We hear genuinely insane targets all the time from organisations, and mostly it's driven out of desperation. You know, we need to raise 5 million by the end of the year. We need to raise 250,000 in the next 3 months. Well, how are you going to raise it? How much have you raised in the last 3 months? And boards and CEOs, I think, you know, are just reacting to the really difficult circumstances. But I think the biggest challenge internally for anyone who's wearing the fundraising hat is to set realistic targets with whoever it is you're dealing with internally and at a board level. Set realistic targets in terms of how much, and set realistic targets in terms of how long this is going to take. It is really, really hard. And if you haven't done fundraising before, or if you haven't done ambitious fundraising before, setting off to do it now with none of your kind of basics covered is just going to waste your time and be a heartbreaking endeavour. So really get real is the thing that I would say to my own organisation and to your own organisations, get that message across. I think the second thing is get organised. You know, fundraising can't be an add-on. So if people are completely stretched to capacity, and in most organisations everybody is at the moment, you know, who is going to do the basics of fundraising? Who's going to do the research on the prospects? Who's going to pull together the case for support? Who's going to do the cultivation and identification of prospects and work on those people? So get organised internally. And then finally, I think we all should just get moving. I mean, if we are serious about doing fundraising, we can't avoid it. Just given, you know, everything else, for most organisations, there's going to be a real need to raise some money, and to raise some money sooner rather than later. So, you know, it's a highly competitive environment. Most of your competitors are probably out there fundraising. So it is just, you know, we have to kind of get on with it, given all the other caveats. But then finally, and I do think that this is, I was in the States last week, and I kind of sat down with the guy who's our fundraising mentor, and I came away, you know, full of ambition and unrealistic targets myself. But, you know, genuinely, if most of us work for an organisation that we believe in, that we know is making a difference, that we know is having an impact, we just have to really focus on that and find the people that we can convince of the importance of that. I mean, what will happen? We were with 4 organisations yesterday, and when we came away from each of them, the question we asked ourselves is, what would happen if that organisation didn't exist? And I think when you can answer that question in an effective way, you have your case for support. But there's no question, it's challenging, and for all of us, we need to pay close attention to the discussion that's going on right now about where fundraised income goes. There is not enough transparency in Ireland around fundraised income. There's not enough accountability around it. I think in 99% of the organisations we see, there isn't a penny that goes astray. Every penny is stretched in ways that it would never be stretched in the commercial sector. So I think we need to be proud of that. I think we need to use that as a selling tool, but we need to be open and honest about that. And so I would really encourage all of you, as you sort of put your case together, to include that in your case. Donors are asking more and more, where does the money go? How much of this is spent on fundraising administration? I'd be really upfront about that. This isn't a voluntary thing. You know, somebody is going to have to be paid to go out and raise the money. Somebody's going to have to be paid to deliver the services. Somebody's going to have to be paid to do all of the things that happen in your organisation. But as a sector, we've been poor on bringing that up, I think. So that's really it kind of on the fundraising side. I mean, the fund application side is literally the other side of the mirror of this. And Jordan's going to talk through what makes a quality application, what sort of information we're looking for, and then, you know, we'll take questions and answers.
So what I'm going to do generally, we're in the process of revising our guidelines for our 2014 grants program. So there's a little bit to be determined, but what I suggested was that once those guidelines are available, we'll make sure that everybody has a copy of them just so they can see them in advance. But what I wanted to do is just talk through some kind of general things that we would look for in applications. Whatever our guidelines are going to be for next year, these things will kind of hold true for those as well. So I suppose kicking off, I mean, as Katrina was saying, it's a hugely competitive fundraising environment at the moment. Ourselves, for our grant round, we get between 700 and 1,000 applications a year over the last 3 years. So hugely competitive. We see a lot of organizations working in similar spaces, and there's a few things that you can do that would make your application stand out kind of in the floods of things that are coming in. The first bit of advice I'd say is absolutely read guidelines very, very thoroughly. Make sure you fit all the eligibility criteria. Funders have it set for a reason. We see a lot of organizations that are just trying to shoehorn themselves into our criteria, and they just don't fit. We'd get applications in one time. You know, one of the things we don't do, it's a small grants program. The average grant is about 5,000, ranging between €500 and 20,000. So a lot of variation within there, but we don't fund capital projects as part of that, mostly because the grants are really modest. We've got applications in for looking for €300 million for stadiums and things like that. So that's from an organisation that didn't read the guidelines at all, didn't kind of browse through any of the things that we were looking for with this particular thing. We can spot them straight away. And from an organisation's point of view, we'd say don't waste your time if you don't fit within the eligibility criteria, because it's going to be discarded very, very quickly. Sometimes our criteria can be kind of subject to interpretation. What we would say is lift the phone and give us a call. If there's a project that you're thinking of, you're not sure if it's a good fit, we're on the end of the line to help steer you through that. Or if you're thinking of two projects, not sure which one might be better, again, we have a pretty good sense of what we're going to be getting in, and we can say actually the project B sounds like something that we don't see much of, and that might stand a better chance. So without being able to kind of guarantee a particular thing is going to receive funding, we can give you just a little bit of support on that before you send in an application. So we would encourage anybody to do that with any funder. Anything that's not clear, take the time to really get to know that funder and what they're looking for, because that will just give you a little bit better shot in the end. One of the things that we see a lot of organizations applying and using jargon and acronyms that we don't know what they mean. Don't assume that your funder knows that much about what you're doing. We operate across really broad different program areas. We don't have the tightest grasp on everything that we see. Some things are really new to us, so we're not experts in the field that you're working in necessarily. So we would say keep it simple, avoid the jargon, just really plain English. What do you want to do? The more applications we read, we kind of come across 4 key questions that, if they're answered and answered well, it makes for a really compelling application. So I'll send you around some guidelines on these, but we would ask organizations to tell us what they're proposing to do, why they're doing it and for whom, why is the organization well positioned to do that work, which is kind of what Katrina was saying earlier. You know, what's your competitive edge? How are you different? We see a lot of applications that might be working with, running an after schools program. Why is yours different, or why is yours better? So we would say, is it years of experience in a particular area, or is it a different approach that might be more effective? Make sure you can explain that and that you know that the ins and outs of that, because the reality is there's lots of organizations competing for funding, and we want to know why what you're proposing is going to stand out, or why we should support that over another application. The fourth thing is really have a clear sense of what success looks like. So some of the things that we like to look at when we're looking at applications, we want to have some sense of value for money. So really simple way to convey that, kind of a bums on seats figure. So how many people are you working with? How much money are you looking for, and how many people will that reach? When we have a sense of numbers, if you're talking about 30 young people, if you're talking about 200, it just gives us a sense or a frame of reference when we're comparing different applications. Outcomes is really, really difficult for people to fit into applications. Sometimes you don't really know what the intended outcome is going to be, but you will have some sense of what's going to be different as a result of your project. If you can tell us that and how you're going to know what's different afterwards, let us know that. So it might be something, it might be a standardized test if you were looking at kind of literacy rates and wanting to improve how people were reading at a certain level. If you're looking at attitudes or skills, it might be a survey, it might be self-assessed by whoever's participating in the program. But just include that in your application, because what we'll want to see, if we're putting money into something, we'll say, what's the desired result going to be, and how are we going to know if we've got there or not? So if we're putting in 5,000 or 15,000, it'll be really helpful for us to see that in your application, so we know at the end of 1 year's time what's going to be different for the people who have participated. Resources. One of the things that we look for in applications, we don't have a matching funding requirement at the moment, but one of the things that makes an application really compelling to us is if an organisation can say, look, we know this project is going to cost 20,000, we know it's going to cost 120, whatever it is, but we secured X amount of funding from these sources already. But if you say, look, we need 100% of the funding from the Ireland funds, that makes it's a really difficult decision for us to make then. Our own resources are limited, any funders' resources are limited. So if we can't put the 100% into that, we're unlikely to be able to fund that application. So if you can part fundraise from a range of different sources, from your public fundraised income, if you have that, let us know that, because it does make a stronger case when we can say, look, we can deliver this program, say, to 20 young people, but if you invest 10,000 in us, we can reach 2,000. Whatever it is. So if we can see what you're doing already and what you might propose to do with a bit of extra support, that will make it a much more compelling application for us. Similarly, if you do have matching funding requirements with other funders, do let us know that, because we would talk to a lot of other funders as well. If we know that somebody is going to give an award to a project, if you secure other funding, that just makes it again more interesting for us, because we can maybe put in 10,000, but that might leverage an additional 20 if you've been fundraising from other sources. So generally, what we say with organizations, the better we know them, the easier their applications are to read. So again, I would say relationships are probably a key thing for us. Once we know the leadership, once we know what you're proposing to do, once you're in touch with us about what's going well or not, any application that you put in is much, much easier for us to assess. So I suppose I'll leave it there for the moment, but if you have any questions specifically about how our review process goes or about what we fund. I'm not sure how familiar everyone is in the room with the Ireland funds or not, so any questions you have on kind of developing proposals or about how we work, we can take them now.
To what extent when you're trying to, show proof or return on investment, would you consider, say, past young people who come through your organisation as an example of, here's what we hope to do, we've been doing it on a shoestring up until now, but look what we've done. Do you accept kind of past pupils or members or
of course, particularly when it's something that's really hard to put your finger on. Do you know what I mean? If you're not looking for something that's necessarily very measurable, kind of cases of success, testimonials, things like that really make it a compelling case for us, because we're saying, it's old thing, is it because you were there while you were there kind of thing. So sometimes it's hard to necessarily link one program to a particular set of outcomes, particularly if you're doing something like youth work. Do you know what I mean? What's the difference in that person's life if the youth worker wasn't there supporting that young person? We won't really know. Do you know? But even to take the case of, say you have a young kid from a tough family, participated in youth workshops, or was involved for a number of years, went up to third level, kind of did a youth work qualification themselves, that kind of thing. Anecdotal evidence does make it really interesting. What people engage with, statistics are really useful, but what we engage with more are stories. So as a way to illustrate a point, it's really, really useful.
My name is Aisha, before this was practicing it, and when you were talking about contributing towards the cost of the project, let's say, putting in your own money, could we take in consideration putting our own time and the human resources rather than money?
Generally, yes. Most organizations would, I'm trying to think of an example where we've seen that. It might be volunteers that they have secured or other in-kind kind of contributions. So if there's a way that you can deliver it and you have secured some resources towards that, if it's financial or if it's human, you need both. Do you know what I mean? So certainly you can put that in to say, look, we have dedicated 2 people, or we have funding already secured for this person's time, but they're going to take on this additional project as well. Put that in, certainly, yeah.
Can you put a numerical number on value on that worker?
Yeah, you can, but what we would ask you to do is just explain why. Is it kind of 5 hours of their time, or how would just give us some breakdown of how you would value that. And similarly, for anything in the budget, people would apply to us for fees to deliver something, which is fine. We don't fund salaries generally through our grant round, and that's because it's a 1-year commitment. So we don't want to kind of fund a position for a year and then we're pulling the plug on it at the end of that time, and there's no kind of guarantee that we'd be able to support it again the following year. If it's a short-term fee, a fee to deliver a particular set of activities, we would allow that, but we would ask you to say, look, it's money for Jordan to deliver 6 workshops, they're 2 hours a piece for 120 participants, that kind of thing. So we have some sense of what that fee is going to deliver. So rather than just saying, John's time for 3 weeks, what is John going to deliver in the time that you're proposing to have him on board? Does that make sense?
Yeah, but just in the idea of the match funding, the in-kind contribution, if you were to say the project's actually going to cost 15,000,
Yeah.
but we are going to, as an organisation, release, say, John for that length of time, and his time actually makes up
at that cost. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So can I ask sort of 2 general questions? The first is, you said a lot of your funding is donor based, so the American philanthropists are actually saying that we want to target this.
Yeah.
Is there any danger, some of the American philosophies could, come down from their view of what the funding is going to be?
We present projects to the donors, so they have to meet our criteria here for funding. So we would never fund something that doesn't meet within our own guidelines for funding, and we've never been asked to either. Actually, I mean, the donors. Our sort of mission when we were founded in 1976 was peace, culture, charity. Over the years we've brought education into that, and kind of everything filters out from that. But there's no. I mean, the organisations that receive funding from our donors have to meet our criteria.
Okay. And just the second part as well, I mean, a lot of what you talked about is financial funding.
Yeah.
There's a huge amount of resources there which are non-financial.
Yeah.
I mean, if you looked at actually applying them, it's just one of the first things like HR, staffing. There might be very specific resources that organisations need, which are not necessarily monetarily.
Yeah, again, that's not really our remit. I mean, we're a fundraising foundation. I think you've hit a really key point, though. I think there's huge opportunity for particularly corporations in Ireland and other individuals in Ireland to contribute their expertise. I mean, there isn't an organisation that we would work with that doesn't need some help around strategic planning, some financial planning, and it's trying to identify the kind of the relationship that can be effective there, that's useful for the organisation and that's a worthwhile engagement for the volunteer. But it's something that comes up all the time. I mean, we could use it ourselves. We would love to get like a financial planner in who would help us in operation, but all organisations, because we're all stretched, nobody has the time to sort of, or the sort of full range of expertise we need. But I think that's an area that we need to tap into more effectively.
Just thinking, for instance, I mean, the government owns the National Concert Hall.
Yeah.
But very few people who think about doing a national event
sure.
actually approach Ms. Medina and say,
absolutely.
The hall, not
absolutely.
And you would, because I've done it and he has offered it.
Yeah, and look, I mean, that's what a platform for an organisation, absolutely.
I think it's what, a speaker this morning said about thinking outside the box.
Absolutely.
It's not necessary. You look at what you're trying to do, it's not necessarily just money.
No, and I mean, the other thing I think is that sort of engagement can often lead, I mean, if it is ultimately financial support that a lot of organisations, a sort of quality engagement at a volunteer level like that can often unlock other sources of support as well. It's not just a cheque. And actually, increasingly, we're finding companies don't want to just write a cheque. They want a much more meaningful engagement. So I think that's crucial.
A lot of big companies are going for charity again, so there's no point in say approaching the Dublin Airport Authority because they've already picked a charity to be doing.
Absolutely.
So some of it could be actually about working for a for 2 or 3 years
Sure.
before you get there.
Yeah, absolutely. That's right. Yeah.
And I think, I mean, because so many of the companies that we've seen recently that they want to do the kind of the financial plus, like you were saying, so having a really good grasp on supports that you need. One of the things, if we contact an organisation, we say, you know, look, if there's a donor interested, the ones that are really impressive are the ones that say, well, here's our wish list.
Yeah.
And Katrina had a meeting yesterday where she said somebody had that ready to go. If we had, you know, X amount of money, here's the things that we could deliver. I would always have something like that in mind. And similarly, if there's skill sets, so if you need help with accounting or legal advice, anything like that, if you have a kind of bank of things that you would benefit from, have that ready, because that might be part of your pitch. And when you're going to talk to particularly corporates, if it's not just asking for a sum of money, if you say, actually, we could use a bit of help of this, that's one way to get them to kind of light up, because we've seen a huge appetite for that recently as well.
Yeah.
This is my first time even hearing about the Ireland funds, and I'm just wondering a bit more about the eligibility, like what's your criteria, who have you worked with, who's got funding before, you know, like just examples of projects, and like, I know if, say, I have a filmmaking project, is that like a philanthropist that's interested in filmmaking, is it that kind of idea, or what, like, just if you explain that.
Yeah, so we have 4 key program areas that are quite broad. So it's arts and culture, community development, education, and peace and reconciliation. So generally, most not-for-profit activities would generally fit within one of those areas. Through our grant round, that's the unrestricted money that we have that Katrina was mentioning. It's usually from event income, and it's money that we get to have a bit of fun with. So it's how we learn, you know, who's leading in different areas, you know, some innovative approaches. That's how we kind of keep our finger on the pulse of what's going on in Ireland each year. So a project like that, I mean, absolutely, arts and cultural organisations do fit within that. The reality is, we only have about $1 million to spend on the grant round. So even projects that are funded there, it doesn't necessarily mean that a donor is going to pick that up as a special area of interest for them. So organisations may have got grant funding from us for a few years. That's not necessarily going to turn into larger sums, but they're certainly eligible under our guidelines and could apply through our small grants program. So it would just depend. So for some, yes, applying to the grant round is kind of, it's the introduction to the funds. It's how we get to know you. It's how we get to kind of, you know, try something with an organisation that we may not have worked with previously. Some of those might graduate to more substantial investment from our donors, and others won't. So it's hard to know what donors are going to pick up on, but certainly within those 4 areas, a lot of things would fit. So,
and if you look at our website, you'll see a list of organisations that have received funding. And as Jordan said, we get applications from about 1,000 organisations a year. So, and we don't ever advertise our grant rounds. There's no point. We don't need to, you know. So it's there's a really broad range. I mean, it'll be hard to think of a non-profit organisation that can't fit into our guidelines.
Yeah. Hi, I just want to, just kind of a question really just around challenges that organisations may face. Like, I work with Toker Family Centre. We're celebrating our 40th year going into 2014, but we basically started as a house that for, you know, that someone was given the keys and told start and off you go. And now we have over 250 people through our doors every day. But our issue is that, first of all, like in terms of funding and stuff like that, if you're, I suppose, going after, we have different funding streams coming for the different services, and if you're presenting that through fundraising that you're guaranteeing 4,000 or 5,000 or whatever for specific projects, that's almost giving a message to some government departments that that's fine, they're securing 5,000, so we'll take that off their budget for next year. So I was just wondering if that's something that you come across, that you know, you can get that across to a government department that this is a specific area, but you know, we can't guarantee that this time next year that 5,000 is going to be there, and that's a massive difference to an organisation like us. Okay, we're relatively small, but in the community that we work with, we are in the middle of the estate, and without that, if it's we're there for 40 years, if we were to close our door in the morning, the impact that would have.
Well, I mean, you know, I think that's actually a huge issue, and it's one, we don't get any government funding, we don't apply for any government funding, so it was one that I was completely unaware of until recently. But the idea that, you know, hard fundraising efforts could be offset by a cut in government.
Like you're doing yourself a disadvantage.
It's actually, I think, gut-wrenching. I mean, I can't think of anything more demotivating in terms of trying to go out and raise money. And, you know, I've heard that quite a bit recently. And I think, you know, I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but you know, if it's on your radar, I mean, I think part of the solution is what you said, you know, this is raised for over and above what you guys are funding. If these are the number of people that can benefit, and you're not funding any of this, like we can't run this program without this fundraised income. And, you know, it goes back to, I think, the challenge just around the understanding of of philanthropy and private giving, you know, being a partner with government instead of a replacement for government funding. But I heard that this morning as part of the discussion about, you know, where does HSE funding cut off and fund, you know, what is fundraised income making up. And I think it's just about trying to get that conversation in front of government officials, whoever you're dealing with in departments, as well as the public. I just think that's the most demotivating. I can't imagine anything more heartbreaking.
Because you're nearly afraid to put yourself out there because you're going to have to.
They're doing fine.
We're grand, but like the other point from my point of view is like the specific project that I'm running as part of the service has been there for 35 years, but yet my ratio, like I have 80 children coming in a week, I'm the only project worker employed to keep, you know, contact with those children, but yet trying to quantify that in outcomes is extremely difficult, you know, in terms of getting around it. And the other thing it goes back to is, okay, we're like a small fish in one estate operating, having that impact on a daily basis. But when you take a national organisation or people that have branches of HR or marketing that can put that lovely proposal and concise thing together, for me, on a day-to-day thing, that could be writing that while I'm supervising a group or taking a call from the social work department. So it's great to hear two guidelines that you don't want the reams of papers and
really don't.
just concise of what it's doing. So that's really good to hear.
I know the one thing I have to say in an organisation like yours where you don't have, you know, if you're fundraising and delivering the programme, I would say, you know, your best bet, I think, in terms of unlocking private funding is getting someone to see what you do. There's just no question. Again, we were at 4 organisations yesterday with different potential supporters, and you know, nothing tells the story better than actually seeing someone in the trenches and really kind of, you know, the incredible energy and kind of expertise and all of that's going on in these places. I mean, that's, of course, it's hard to get someone there, but when you do, that's half the battle. And just one other thing I would just add, you know, if you are applying for a grant from us, give yourselves the best chance and get your application in with some time. We are not lying when we say that 95% of our applications come in the last 2 hours of our 2-month open application period. Now, I am a procrastinator. Nobody is more last minute than me, but it's a bit heartbreaking because we can see how much time the application takes. And a 43-minute application versus a 2.5-hour application, there is no comparison. You can tell when everyone's just kind of flung it in to get it in by 5. Like, give yourself a fair shot. Like, take a little bit of time. And again, I wish I could say this to myself on a daily basis because I never get anything in on time. But you're doing yourself a real service. And every year we have distressed callers after the 5 o'clock deadline. It's an online application. We can't take it in after 5. So just give yourself a bit of a fair chance of maybe getting in on Wednesday rather than Friday, you know, after the month.
And just on that,
we have to finalise that, but it's probably February of next year. And instead of opening it for 2 months, we're going to open it for 1. It doesn't matter, it all comes in the last day.
I'm just conscious that they're setting up for lunch, but happy if you're happy or you have to keep talking because there is a lot of conversation being generated. So was there 1 or 2 more questions there? Did I see somebody else? Yeah.
Just wanted to pick up on something the very last one, that's actually crucial, and so that's something that they were the same thing came up. Actually, I don't think it's that we don't necessarily have a very okay grasp maybe on philanthropic funding where we might look for what we might look for. I do think there is an issue with statutory funding and philanthropic funding being seen in almost in competition with each other. And I think that this conversation can very easily be had at a higher policy level. For people who are making these kinds of decisions, I understand that whole notion of philanthropic funding. And I think one of the reasons we get late applications is we're hoping we're going to get statutory funding. We wait, we discover we haven't got it, and we think we're looking around desperately saying, where the hell do we go now to try and make this project happen? And I think there are a number of very interesting points you made, because this is a very interlocking circumstance.
Absolutely.
Because we don't have that tradition in the country. So I think there's a number of areas to be done.
But you know, I think you're so right on that. I mean, I think one of the things, and again, I always feel like I'm sounding a little Pollyanna when I say this, but you know, people don't know what they don't know about this sector. They don't know what is being delivered. They don't know the budgets that organisations are working on. They don't know the number of kids that come through organisations, the transformational effect that many of these programmes have. I'm trying, I was at something recently and Geraldine Kennedy was speaking about trust and all of that. And one of the conversations that came up was, how do we engage the media on this more? Like, why does the media jump all over the CEO salary story, but never over I don't know what the answer is to that, but I think that we need to I think there needs to be more higher level discussions about this because, you know, most of the news from these sorts of organisations, from the organisations that apply to us, you will rarely see like you know, a poor organisation. I don't mean poor financially. I mean, you know, an organisation that wouldn't actually really want to get the story out. And that is the challenge. But you know, what is the collective story? Because philanthropy is never going to grow. I don't think people don't understand that. And then, where is government a partner? Where is government you know, an instigator of philanthropy? How does government really support philanthropy? But you know, what does that mean on a practical day-to-day level? I don't know. But you're right. The conversation needs to happen on all sorts of levels. You know.
Apologies. Okay, we'll just take one more, but it's just in terms of people will be coming into
course,
this room for lunch, so we'll just take one more and then perhaps wrap up.
We're around if anyone has
Katrina and
questions.
Jordan are around, and so the set up for lunch here is 1:45, and the lunch will run through until 2. So take some time to ask some questions if something does pop up in the meantime. But you just have one more question here.
Yeah, probably it's a quick one. When you're accepting funding applications, do you accept, you know, you've got a word count on it, do you accept like a link?
No, yeah, they have to be kind of self-contained. So that's, I mean, it's one of the exercises that we try to do with Katrina, saying keep it as concise as possible. It's like the Hemingway approach to, you know, this kind of bare bones structure. So the text boxes are really tight, and that's one of the criticisms that we have got from donors. But all typed out, I mean, a proposal really, you should be able to get it in 1 to 2 pages. Do you know what I mean? All the information enough to say, if we want to know more, we will contact organisations and say, actually, can you tell us more about this, or we need a bit of backup on something else. In general, like, I would keep it as sharp as you can. Sorry. Yeah.
And we know it's hard, but we get 1,000 applications. We just can't go through 1,000 links or 1,000 attachments. So that's.
I'm just thinking of links to the video.
Absolutely, yeah.
But generally, I mean, what I will say is kind of keeping in touch with us around the grant round. We do, like, I'd get newsletters in. It's really, really helpful. I would look at things. It gives me a greater sense of what your organisation is doing. So I'd say if you do have mailing lists, like that kind of information is really helpful because we will look at it, and when we do get an application in, there's some degree of familiarity already. Do you know what I mean? So even if you can include it in the application, it might be worth getting to us. Do you know?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Katrina and George. It's really concrete.